Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. We're going to jump right in with Larry Johnson, who served in the State Department Special Operations and in the CIA for upwards of 24 years, training State Department and CIA and military personnel and special operations. He has a consulting firm, but I've been watching Larry for a very long time, commenting on what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on in Ukraine. So today, everyone, we're going to cover the gamut. We're going to start with Larry's analysis of what's going on in Gaza and the larger region of the Middle East. We'll take about 30 minutes or so for that, and then we'll segue to his analysis of what's going on in Ukraine, and then we'll conclude with some comments on the implications of this on the geostrategic position of the United States. I want to just begin, Larry, with noting two aspects of the ongoing student protests, and I thought that would be a good place for us to begin. One at Columbia University, where they were given an ultimatum last Friday that they had to cease and desist or they would be suspended and possibly blocked from participation on the campus. They were also notified that the university had identified many of them. And last night, rather than dispersing, they took over the Hamilton Hall, which was exactly the same hall that Mario Savio and the student protesters back in 1968 took over in protest against the Vietnam War. And then in University of Texas in Austin, the nonviolent protest was assaulted by the police, but in an extraordinary turn of events, after the police had arrested the people that were there, hundreds of students and faculty materialized almost out of nowhere, and eventually the police were forced to retreat. So we have an escalating protest around the United States and around the world. And I thought that would be a good place for us to begin, Larry. How do you understand these protests? What do you think the effect of these protests will be on U.S. policy in Gaza?
Yeah, I think it's deja vu all over again. So I am old enough to remember 1968. I was only 13 at the time, but I do remember how this was portrayed in the media. And I've seen a lot of similarities. It's, as Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. The protests are well organized. So, clearly there is a group or groups of people that are behind this, that are helping organize it. I mean, the signs that are printed up, they're pre-printed, they're well done. But that doesn't mean that the message that they're conveying is somehow illegitimate. It's just the opposite. It is a legitimate message. And as we saw with the Vietnam War, where it was blamed, these protesters were blamed as outside agitators, as tools of the communists, as undermining American policy. Ultimately, they got it right. I mean, despite all of the attempts to quash those protests then, the message is what has prevailed, and ultimately the failed policy, the evil policy of the United States government at the time was reversed. And I think that's where we're in the same situation now. That's where we're headed. The dominance of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee over American politics for the last 50 years, I think it's coming to an end. This uh, while there are elements that are organizing these protests, a lot of it is also organic. Kids are showing up because they can read, they can see social media.
Sure.
The Israelis like to cry and moan about, oh, they killed 1,200 of us on October 7th, the worst since the Holocaust. And meanwhile, they slaughter over 40,000 people, and nobody breaks a sweat. I mean, the disproportion in the violence is, I find it sickening and outrageous. There's a video circulating today. I'm not sure if it was in Columbia, University of Columbia, but this one young Jewish gal with her dog walks into one of these encampments, stands there, and then proceeds to call 911, claiming she's being attacked and surrounded and threatened. And meanwhile, they're videotaping this, showing that this crazy woman could leave at any time that she wanted. She was trying to provoke an incident. And Israel's successful use of victimhood in the past, I think, is now coming to an end. Because this is not confined to the United States. This is global. These student protests, they're taking place in places around the world, in Turkey and in Greece in particular, because in the past, Greece and Turkey were sort of favorably disposed towards Israel, and that's turning right now. So Israel has created for itself a public relations debacle, and they think they can kill their way out of this, and they can't.
Well, let's talk about the larger context of what's going on. Many people believe that the problem really was generated on October 7th with the attack by Hamas and then the Israeli response. But as you've pointed out on other programs, this is a very deep-seated issue of occupation and resistance that has been developing for decades, actually beginning in 1948 when Israel was established as a state. So take a few minutes and just give us your sense of the history and context for what's happening right now, because I think not only is the influence of IPAC coming to a reckoning, but I think the state of Israel is really coming to a reckoning, and the whole Zionist project. This is a momentous moment in the Middle East that's much larger than October 7th to April 30th, where we are today.
Yeah, you're correct. Too much of the current discussion tries to look at October 7th as the starting point, and it's anything but. This really, at the root of all of this is what I described as Israel's victimhood, because the establishment of the state of Israel was seen as a response to the Holocaust, the German attempt to exterminate Jews from Europe and the former Soviet Union, and the failure of that. But we had all these displaced persons, so they needed a place to go, and so Israel starts its life in 48, and it keeps going up until the 67 war, where again Israel is seen as the David, the Arabs are seen as the Goliath. That's how it was always presented. In fact, in 48, when the state is established and then the war breaks out, it's tiny David, Israel, and giant Goliath, Palestinians, trying to kill the poor little David. And so that's the theme that gets the story that's told. Nothing said about the pervasive attempt of that new nation of Israel to destroy and remove Palestinians from territory that was their own for centuries. And it's not just me, the goy Larry Johnson talking about this. Ilan Pappé, a German, born of German parents in Israel, raised in Israel, Jewish, he's written extensively about it as a historian. So it's not my opinion. It is a matter of fact. The victimhood theme continued to resonate up to the 73 war, and then with the terrorist attack and the Entebbe, where Israel goes in and dramatically rescues all of these hostages from, I think it was the elements of the Baader-Meinhof gang out of Germany. And so that created, if you will, a political base of support in the United States. We love the story of the underdog that fights and overcomes superior odds. Never throughout this period has the story of the Palestinians been told. And so here is Israel steadily encroaching upon Palestinian territory in the West Bank. And even while it's condemned, and the peace process during the Oslo process in the 1990s tried to set in motion efforts to get them to withdraw. That didn't happen. They continued to expand. And underlying all of this, it does not get discussed much on regular news shows and many podcasts, are the eschatological religious beliefs that govern both Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And each one has a different story of the end of times, a different story about whether the Messiah has come back or the Messiah is going to come back, or and they're all positioning themselves for what can we do to accelerate this process. And so when you're dealing with that level of religious fanaticism, this, the tendency to try to deal with the politics and peace negotiations as a abstract political issue of dividing up economic spoils and trying to treat everybody fairly, that disappears, because this is ultimately this fervent religious belief. And then when you get to Hamas emerges in 1987, and it's basically the spark that ignites it is the Israelis, an Israeli military vehicle runs over and kills 4 Palestinian civilians. And Sheikh Yassin and some around him gets here. What can we do about this? So that's where they started Hamas. But who steps in to help fund Hamas? The government of Israel. We've got that through multiple Israeli sources, that they stepped in. Why? Because they wanted to create this Hamas, who was they were really motivated by a religious vision, a Sunni vision. And the Israeli officials saw them as a way to undermine Yasser Arafat and the PLO. Because remember, during this period, starting in the 1990s, there was growing international pressure on Israel to accept this peace deal with Yasser Arafat and the PLO. And the Israelis figured out the best way we can sabotage that is to create this alternative that will be empowered, that then can help discredit the entire process, which is ultimately what happened. You can say that they were successful in that regard. The theme, though, of armed Israeli police, military units killing unarmed Palestinians was there from the very beginning. The Temple Mount massacre, I think it was 1990, somewhere in there. It's what we're seeing today. It's this lopsided violence, and yet Israel's gotten away with proclaiming, "Oh, we're the victim. These bad Palestinians are killing us all the time." And then when you look at the actual numbers, and it's staggering. The Palestinians are now in the tens of thousands. The Israelis, barely break 2,000, I think. So lots of hypocrisy.
Yeah, well, thank you. In the middle of this particular conflict is the regional contest between not only Israel and Hamas, but Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and at a larger level, Israel and Iran. You also have the Houthis operative. Share with us your analysis of the regional implications of the genocide in Gaza and how it's going to be playing itself out as events unfold. We've now come to a juncture where there's the possibility, on the one hand, of a ceasefire, and on the other hand, the final assault on Rafah. You have Anthony Blinken today, I believe it is, in Jordan, having been in the Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. What's your current sense of what's actually at play in this moment?
The United States is trying desperately to stay relevant, because what this says, this entire response to October 7th has exposed the weakness now of the United States in the region, that we're declining power. So let's start with the Houthis. The Houthi decision to try to shut down the Red Sea to all Israeli Jewish shipping and to impose basically a blockade on Israel has succeeded, despite the fact that the United States deployed a carrier task force group and has been relentlessly bombing sites inside Yemen. We're going on 6 months now. And what have we accomplished? Well, we've shown that a bedraggled group of people living, maybe, as we like to say, in the 15th century, have thwarted the United States with all of its, supposed superior military capability. And sort of behind the scenes of all of this is, you've got to step back and look at the war in Ukraine as well, because the United States' attempt to isolate and destroy Russia backfired, because with the unity between Russia and China, they then were reaching out and able to actually intervene in the Middle East in ways that completely reversed U.S. Policy. They stopped the war between Iran and Yemen. I mean, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, which was a proxy war between the United States and Iran. And Russia and China got that stopped, were key to reestablishing relations between the Saudis and the Iranians. Well, there goes one of the cornerstones of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It was all predicated on, we've got to be strongly aligned with all these Gulf states in order so we can defeat Iran. And, shifting back to the Houthis for a moment, when the rest of the region sitting there watching saying, the United States can't stop the Houthis, how in the name of God are they going to do anything with the Iranians? Because the Iranians are in a much stronger military position. Well, it can really shut down the Straits of Hormuz if they decided to. So that's leading everybody to sort of step back. Now, the other dimension in this is Hamas was never widely liked or beloved by the other Arab nations. The Egyptians didn't like them. Turks didn't like them. Saudis didn't like them. But what Israel has succeeded in doing is forcing those governments to like Hamas. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, it's set off a political process at the street level in each of those countries that they're very much now, they're seeing David and Goliath. They're seeing the Israeli Goliath killing, crushing the Palestinian David, killing women, killing children, brutally bombing civilian areas day after day after day. And the rest of the world stays largely silent, says nothing. It doesn't do anything to stop it. So that is, while some of the leadership of those countries have been hesitant to go full-throated opposition to Israel, the people that constitute those nations are applying political pressure in that regard. And then that brings back Iran, because Iran is this boogeyman that the United States, if we didn't have Iran, we would create an Iran. Mm-hmm. Because Iran provides us a villain that we can use to justify all sorts of madness. And yet, the reality of the history of Iran in the region is Iran didn't just spring out of nowhere. There's a context. In the United States, the Iran that exists today wouldn't exist if it were not for the actions of the United States in 1953 and in destroying and overthrowing the democratically elected government of Mossadegh. That's for starters. And then when you jump ahead in the establishment of the Islamic Revolution in 1979, what two countries in the world decided it would be a good idea to provide weapons and arms to this radical Islamic state? Oh, that would be the United States and Israel. Okay. So yeah, that's why I say I listen to the sanctimony and the outrage voiced by a lot of American politicians today about Iran this, Iran that, and I go, guys, we were the enablers. We were the facilitators. And we also made sure that a lot of Iranians got killed by a lot of Iraqis who were using, under Saddam Hussein, using chemical weapons that we helped supply as well. So we were playing both sides of the fence. And I think a lot of these countries, they step back and they realize that. So the United States is seen as this consummate meddler that's going to, create mayhem and destruction. And let's not forget, 2006, the United States decides to remove the Mujahideen al-Khalq from the list of terrorist groups. They continue carrying out terrorist attacks in Iran, and we're backing it. ISIS, created in 2003 as a result, direct consequence of the United States invasion of Iraq, they organize and start attacking Shia. They're not attacking U.S. troops. They're attacking Shia Muslims because they're apostates as far as this radical Sunni vision of Islam goes. And it was so bad that Zarqawi, the founder of ISIS, he got rebuked in a letter by Osama bin Laden and Zawahiri, his number two. How bad is it when Osama bin Laden's telling you, hey, you're going too far, killing all these people? Yeah. But Zarqawi kept it up. And then he shifted. He was also killing Americans. Then moved into Syria. We're in Syria. Decided he was going to help overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And good gee, many Christmas. That interest coincided with the Brits and the Americans too. So here we have ISIS and the United States and the United Kingdom working together to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And who is ISIS carrying out terrorist attacks against? Iran. So, the conventional theme that, well, we're there to spread democracy, we're there to stop terrorism, is it's a crude expression, but it's the most, it encapsulates it the best. It's bullshit.
Well, that puts it pretty clearly.
Yeah, it's just it's outrageous.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the other aspects of outrage on the part of the rest of the world is the way that the U.S. generally for the last 75 years, but I think Joe Biden in particular over the last 6 months have been so fastidious in actually supporting Israel with everything it needs to do what it's doing, while at the same time having this rhetoric of indecision and imploring Israel not to do what it's doing at the same level, but doing nothing actually to stop it, and in fact supporting it every step of the way, including blocking the ceasefire resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. I saw in the news today that Netanyahu has asked President Biden to block the International Criminal Court issuing indictments against Netanyahu and the Defense Minister Gantz there in Israel. Talk to us a little bit about your understanding. You were in the State Department, you were in the CIA. How do you understand this extraordinary support for Israel, even though the result of it is to radically erode U.S. credibility and effectiveness to the global community?
Too bad we can't pull up a clip of Joel Grey, Liza Minnelli from Cabaret singing money, 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 because that's what it is. It's money. the emergence of the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee in the 1970s that's when it really became a force. They realized, hey, we've got the United States has the best Congress that money can buy. So let's buy it. And they did.
And they did.
And it was a bipartisan shopping spree. And, that started, gosh, you go back to like 1980. This was let's call it, this is the Jewish Hajj. Like the Muslim Hajj is go to Mecca once a year and march around the shrine there in Mecca.
Kaaba.
The Kaaba. There we go. Thank you. This takes place in Washington, D.C. at the American-Israeli Political Action Committee meeting, where all Republicans and Democrats come and genuflect and bow and do their religious observances. Yeah. Oh yeah, we're with you 100%. The number one recipient of funds from the Jewish groups, of particular AIPAC, Mr. Joseph Biden. Over the years, he's number one. So, this it's in the academic world, it's a nice idea to believe that you can have a set of rational principles and you can take logic and you can look at observable, objective facts about, who has the larger population and who has the more educated population and who has this resource and that you can come logically explain policy outcome. That's not what happens here. This is about who's paid for it, who's got the influence, and that's who we're going to line up with, regardless of what any other objective facts are. And we'll even create narratives and stories, fairy tales, to justify our approach. So the one I've always heard is those Palestinians, we've given them every opportunity for peace, and they keep rejecting it because they just hate the Jews. Well, that's not true, but that's the story. It's become the conventional wisdom. And I could walk you inside State Department or CIA now, and you would meet people who would mouth the same nonsense. So there's no real thinking that goes into it. We're at the level of emotion.
Yeah. Well, let's round off this discussion before we transition to Ukraine with two questions. First, Larry, is if you were advising President Biden at this moment, what, in your judgment, would be the optimal way that the U.S. could comport itself in that region to both solve the problem and also restore some level of U.S. credibility to the international community?
I'd cut off all aid to Israel immediately and put the Israelis on notice. This is going to stop. Pull back your troops, shut down the aircraft, get back into your lanes, get back into your borders, and then we're going to rebuild Gaza. And you're going to start removing your forces from the West Bank. Pull out. That's Palestinian territory. That's not your territory. And in return for that, we're going to work with the other governments in the region, with the Jordanians, with the Egyptians, with the Saudis, to ensure that Hamas does not try to push Israel into the sea, that Israel will have the right to exist, but not exist as it does right now. But see, that can't happen because the political blowback in this country would be so extreme. It would be seen as, you're sending them to the gas chambers. So, but I believe that kind of action would actually, bring an end to this, because we've been enabling the violence all along. We try to pretend that we haven't been, but we have been. And what's really sort of turned me to my very outspoken stance now with respect to Israel is the complete lack of fire discipline. They shoot unarmed people regularly, consistently, routinely.
Intentionally.
Yeah. And it's not accidentally. It's not someone who's fumbling, trying to defend themselves from something, and an accidental shot goes off and hits an innocent person. They're deliberately shooting unarmed civilians. And we're countenancing that. The United States is enabling and supporting that. And so that's what's got to stop first. And then, because there is in Israel groups of Israelis, groups of Arabs, groups of Muslims, groups of Palestinians, groups of Christians, that they actually get together, they converse, they talk, they organize, but they're small. But at least they've shown that there is that potential to bring that kind of healing that will, get everybody back in their lanes instead of, trying to kill each other.
Now, given the fact that it's highly unlikely that the president will take your very wise counsel.
Yeah.
And Netanyahu now is poised and has said this morning in Jerusalem that they're going to wipe out Rafah with or without a ceasefire. What's your sense of what's about ready to take place? Do you think that the final assault on Rafah is going to happen? Do you see the U.S. Doing anything about it? How does this end in your understanding?
Well, that's the point. It does not
Given the
end.
reality.
Yeah. It doesn't end. So I fully expect Israel. They're torn because on the one hand, they're saying they got to do this in order to sort of save face, I guess, with their very ultra-Orthodox or ultra-conservative supporters in Israel. But they're also looking at up north to Hezbollah, because they talked about invading going into southern Lebanon from northern Israel, because Hezbollah has shut down several of the kibbutzim up on the north. They're uninhabitable now. So Israel, without military support from the United States, can barely try to carry out those two operations. And so if they decide to go into Rafah, I think in light of the protests that are taking place in this country, that will escalate the protests, number one. It will increase the images of circulating on social media of dead Palestinian women, children, civilians across the board. So it's going to bring greater pressure on Israel, and Israel is going to become even more isolated. And at that point, it's going to create such domestic political turmoil here in the United States as the Democratic Party. I set the Republicans aside. The Republicans are going to support Israel no matter what. So let's take that as a given. The wild card are the Democrats. And because you've got within the Democrats this division, those who support the Palestinians and those who back Israel 100%. Despite the warnings from Blinken and from Biden, I think Netanyahu will do it. He's like a degenerate drug user. Tell him, hey, don't use that fentanyl to kill you. No, and he uses it and winds up dead. I think that's where nothing good is going to come. Israel's not going to have peace. Israel's not going to have economic security. Israel's not going to have greater support among the international community if they do this. It's going to be just the opposite, more isolated and greater pressure brought upon them. Even you've seen, for 5 months, Erdogan of Turkey, he talked a great game. You're worse than Hitler, but kept the money flowing, kept the oil flowing, kept the trade going. Yeah, you're worse than Hitler, but here's under the table. Now he's cut it off. The pressure is so great politically because his party just got its ass handed to it in one of the local elections, that now that he said, okay, we're cutting off trade. Okay, where's Israel going to make that up? Not easy. So the trajectory of what's taking place in Israel, they're going towards a car wreck. They're sort of like Thelma and Louise. They're driving off the cliff into the Grand Canyon, and gravity takes over, and the end is not pretty.
Yeah. And that's a good juncture to segue to Ukraine, because Thelma and Louise have driven off the Grand Canyon and Ukraine is being destroyed. So let's talk about Ukraine. And the first uh, point that I'd love to have you address is what's your understanding of what's currently going on in the war? There's been a conspicuous absence of news coverage in
Yeah.
the West, and now the beginnings of articles here and there pointing to kind of a catastrophic collapse of the Ukrainian military and further advances of the Russian military. What's your analysis of what's going on there right now?
Yeah, it's real simple. The Ukrainian defense line in the eastern part of Ukraine and the Donetsk and up into Luhansk and is collapsing, and the Russians are moving all across the front, almost at will, and it's a combination of things. Number one, and the West has never really fully grasped what Russia's strategy was. Russia was dead serious when it said its goal was to demilitarize Ukraine. Well, how do you demilitarize something? You destroy their manpower primarily. And then you destroy their air defense systems. And then you destroy their ability to deliver artillery. And so that's been what Russia's been doing. And many of the West kept saying, Russia's weak because they're not making advances. They're not doing the lightning war, strike, shock and awe like we do in America. Yeah, how'd that work out in America? That list of wars we won, like in Vietnam and Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Okay. So we really haven't been so successful, and we're going up against guys that are wearing sandals and carrying Kalashnikovs. So Russia's gone through the initial phase. When you go back to 2022, Russia thought that through the military pressure it would apply, because it did surround Kiev, would bring Ukraine to the negotiating table. And in fact, it did.
Yeah.
And the negotiations reached the point where they had a tacit agreement at the end of March. And so in response to that, the Putin ordered those tank units that were north of Kiev to withdraw. Now, that was portrayed in Western media as, the Ukrainians beat the Russians back and forced the retreat. Well, that was another lie. It just was not true. And at the same time, Ukraine, with the help of the West, launched an intensive propaganda campaign centered around Bucha, claiming that the Russians had slaughtered all these civilians, when in fact they'd been killed by Ukrainians. So at that point, by September of 2022, Russia realized, okay, we're actually in a proxy war with NATO. I think they underestimated that at the outset. They didn't necessarily think NATO was that crazy, and they discovered, no, they are. So they mobilized 300,000 troops, and unlike the Ukrainians, those 300,000 troops that get mobilized, they actually have to go through training. Now, for them, it was refresher training because the majority were former military personnel. So you weren't having to send them through 13 weeks of basic training and then another 3 months of advanced individual training, but they still went through training. And then starting in January of 2023, the Russian army starts signing up 40,000 new recruits a month. Do the math. It winds up on almost 500,000 new soldiers come into the Russian army on top of that 300,000 and on top of what was already like 400,000. So all of a sudden, the Russian army is tripled in size. And then coming into this year, the same number, 30,000 plus are signing up every month. So Russia's playing a long game now. And they've moved some of these forces onto just north of Kharkiv. They've set up a new military unit there. So they're poised to really destroy the entire Ukrainian army and push it back across the Dnieper River. over the last 3 weeks, they're taking a new city, new town, new village every day. It's not just, we got accustomed to the Battle of Bakhmut, which went on for, 12 months. These things are sometimes not lasting 12 hours. So the Russians are moving forward. And this, the West keeps thinking they can spend money. Oh, this is our failure to provide money and weapons to the Ukrainians. That's why they're losing. No, they don't have the manpower. The Russia has inflicted so many casualties on the Ukrainians that they don't have a trained army anymore. They've got a few people, but they're increasingly having to dig down, scrape the bottom of the barrel, bring up some of the youngest people who are not seasoned combat veterans to put in command of brigades and battalions. They don't have air defense. And with that lack of air defense now means that the Russians operate with impunity all along the line. And they're using these glide bombs that are 1,500, and there's one that's 3,000 kilograms. That's a lot of explosives. And it levels buildings, it can take out bridges. Up to this point, Russia has not destroyed the bridges across the Dnieper River. Now, I was told that one of the reasons was that so many of those bridges were connected with dam systems to control water flow. But I started checking out the list of dams, and that's not true. I think what Russia allowed those bridges to stay intact so they could draw as much of the Ukrainian army across so they could kill them. The more you draw them into a trap, you kill them. And then you're going to reach a point where they say, okay, we've done enough damage on that front. Now blow the bridges. And they'll trap, they could trap potentially 125,000 Ukrainian soldiers behind, they'll be trapped on this side of the Dnieper River and will surrender. At that point, that's going to bring the war to just a quick stop. So the Russia is in control on the battlefield, and it's also in control diplomatically. The West is beside itself. It has no strategy other than, very early on in the war, I always use the meme out of Saturday Night Live when they did a skit based on Blue Oyster Cult, and it was called More Cowbell. Christopher Walken would come out and said, "That's great, but we need more cowbell." Bang, 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 bang. More cowbell. That's the West's prescription here. More cowbell, and it's not going to make a difference.
Yeah, I fear you're right. Just as a comment on the Russian strategy, again, to get your illumination, this strategic framing of Russia around what they call aggressive attrition is deeply embedded in the Russian psyche and in the Russian military strategies, since the invasion of Napoleon, and the invasion of Hitler, and now the invasion of the Americans and NATO. The Russians don't do anything fancy. They just grind the enemy down.
Yeah.
Until the enemy collapses. And it's a little shocking that the American and NATO military planners, knowing that they're going against Russia, wouldn't have taken into consideration that this tactic is what the Russians always do, which is the reason why they always win. And we're seeing it now. And one of the points that Alexander Mercouris and others have been saying, and you've been on some of these programs, but I think it's worth noting, is that even if you give the Ukrainians more money, there aren't more weapons available in the U.S. and NATO arsenals to even give them. And I know that the Czech president has been scouring the international black market for artillery shells and wanted to get a quick 800,000 shells, and has been very hard place to get even 200,000 and is paying as much as he would if he bought 800,000, given the inflationary pressures on these matters. And I'd like for you to explain that, Larry, because here you have the United States with a massive defense budget.
Yeah.
Bigger than the next 10 nations.
Yeah.
And we don't have enough Patriot systems, artillery shells, anti-aircraft, so forth, to even give the Ukrainians. How did this happen? How does all this money not produce what a small nation like Ukraine needs to engage in combat?
Yeah, it started 50 years ago. We impoverished ourselves in Vietnam, and then proceeded on an economic strategy of dismantling our industries. You know, I've told this story several times in other podcasts, but Jim, I think it's worth repeating that when I went to high school and I graduated, my father worked at Armco Steel, previously known as Sheffield Steel Plant. One of my other buddies, his dad worked at Standard Oil Corporation, the actual oil facility. They pumped oil. Another one worked at Bendix. Another one worked at Alice Chalmers. Another one worked at the General Motors Leeds plant. The point was, in that area, I grew up in Independence, Missouri, but Independence, Kansas City, it's all one big metropolitan area. There was all of this industry that people were going to factories. They were making things, and they had good, solid middle-class wages. And those good, solid middle-class wages were able to support other businesses. Went back for my 50th high school reunion. All those factories are gone. And with them, the jobs. Hey, but now you can get a great job as a manager of a Wendy's hamburger joint. No, how about Mr. Steak? Or, so it's service industry. It's not making anything. And so the colossus that was the United States when World War II started, where it had all of this industrial capability that was underutilized, man, I got kicked into gear. We were churning out tanks, planes, aircraft carriers, destroyers, trucks. And it was unbelievable how much the United States could produce. And then, so we've lived with that illusion that we're still that group of people, and we're not. And that's what this war has exposed. Russia is still that country. Russia is still the same industrial colossus that it was in World War II. In fact, we don't appreciate what the Soviets did at the start of that war, as the Germans were rolling east and taking over large swaths of territory. The Soviets dismantled, literally took down factories, entire factories, packed them up on trains and shipped them east of the Ural Mountains, and then rebuilt them. They did that in a period of 12, 15 months. Can you imagine having to take down like a major automobile plant in Chicago, load it on a train, ship it to Alaska, which is about the same distances from Western Ukraine to the Ural Mountains, and then rebuild that factory and have producing cars in 12 months? I don't think Americans could do it then or now, but that's what the Soviets accomplished back then. So here we now have our defense strategy is built around defense lobby. And I know a little bit about that because my next door neighbor, when I lived in Bethesda, was the largest defense lobbyist in the city. And I saw exactly, what he did and how he worked. His job was to sign up new clients. He'd give him lots of money. And then his job was to set up dinners and lunches that were fundraising events for members of Congress, so that these corporations would show up and give them money. And then those members of the Congress would turn around and vote whatever those corporations wanted for weapons packages. And the weapons systems the United States were providing were not guided by any kind of national security strategy. It was more like, this is what we want. Oh, this would be great to have.
Mhm.
And but they never produced. It also was no incentive to have it as cheap as possible. Sometimes it got so sophisticated it made it even more costly. Which, look at the aircraft carrier now costs like $12 billion just for one aircraft carrier. They can be destroyed by $1 million hypersonic missile that the Russians have or the Chinese have. So just like that, take out $12 billion with a $1 million missile. Very cost effective. So here's the United States, who had not stopped. We have not fought a peer, another country that has the same kind of potential as ourselves since World War II. Some might argue Korean War, maybe to an extent, but certainly nothing since 1960. So we've always fought these third world midgets that are
And been beaten by them.
oh yeah, you gotten beaten, but we never admit to losing. No, they didn't
Yeah.
beat us.
Yeah.
But they did, and we've wasted the trillions of dollars that have been spent in these misadventures, military misadventures overseas. And that's where the starkest contrast comes between Russia and the United States. The only overseas military adventure the Russians had was in Afghanistan in 1979. And again, that was precipitated. That at least had the invitation of some of the Afghan authorities in, because they were dealing with this Islamic uprising. And they went in to contain it. And what did we do? Man, we went in threw gasoline on that fire. Let's give something to help weaken the Soviets, without thinking through, are we enabling a group of radical Islamists that could potentially come back and attack us? Let's not think about that.
Yeah, and out comes Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, but when you look at it, Russia has not wasted its youth, its blood, its treasure on overseas adventures. They've talked about defending Russia. And as you correctly noted, Napoleon invaded in 1812. Then you had the Crimea War, 1854-55, where again, France and the United Kingdom, they're attacking in Crimea. And while that's not Russia proper at that time, it was still viewed by the Russians as an outside threat. Then the Japanese war with Russia, and then you had the revolution, and again, Western forces tried to invade Russia 1918, 1919, and then jump ahead to Hitler. And right at the end of World War II, what does the West do? We turn around and start hiring Nazis as spies to target the Soviet Union. So the fact that the Russians have a little bit of paranoia is not without merit. It's there's a context to it. And now here they're facing a deliberate attempt by the West to use Ukraine as a proxy to destroy Russia, to break it up into various parts so the West can exploit it. And the Russians are saying, nope, not going to happen. And the West is completely unprepared for the fight, completely unprepared.
Well, let's turn then to what you think is the probable outcome. Here you have, a 1,200-kilometer front line.
Right.
The Russians are now breaking through the Ukrainian forces. In the last week or so, there's been I think 3 or 4 Ukrainian battalions that have surrendered.
Right.
En masse. You have increasing consternation in Kiev. You've got the Russians now putting pressure on Kharkiv. It looks probable that before too long, the Russians will have all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River.
Right.
And then what? What is your sense of what will probably unfold in Ukraine, say over the next 6 to 9 months?
Yeah, I think you're right. They'll definitely they'll take to the Dnieper. They will capture Kiev. The government, the current Zelensky's government is going to be illegal within 2 weeks because his cancellation of the presidential elections and then unilaterally declaring himself, hey, I'm going to continue to be president. That really creates puts him at a disadvantage as far as international law goes. I fully expect the Russians to take Odessa as well and to go into Transnistria. So they'll essentially shut off Ukraine from any access to the Black Sea, period. This has got some real interesting economic implications for the United States because of Blackwater and these other U.S. investors that have literally poured billions into Ukraine. They're expecting a major payoff because they were betting Ukraine was going to win and they would be controlling all of this farmland and mineral wealth in Ukraine that's not going to be under the control of the Russians. So that's going to create a real economic hit in the West that we haven't even thought about. I think once Russia consolidates that position, and by that point, the election in the United States will be over. I think then the Europeans will finally wake up and recognize that they need to negotiate with Russia. And then it'll be a negotiation over what's going to happen with what's left of Ukraine. Because the Poles certainly would like to recapture some of the territory that's in Western Ukraine that was originally Poland. Ditto for the Romanians, ditto for the Hungarians. So it could get carved up and will become a very tiny entity compared to what it was prior to February 2022.
That's extraordinary. So you see the Russians potentially taking even Kiev, Odessa.
Yeah.
If that happens, it's over for Ukraine.
Right.
It's essentially over.
Yeah. No, I think the Russians are no longer of a mood to talk or negotiate with the West. The West has squandered that. We've killed too many of their civilians. The West continues to say they send Storm Shadow missiles, the Brits, the French, HIMARS from the United States, and these are being used against civilian targets, not against military targets, against civilian targets in Russia. And we've mistaken Russian patience for weakness, which is a terrible mistake to make because it's just they're growing stronger in their resolve. They're going to make us pay. They're not going to put up with it. And frankly, when we get punched in the face, we're going to deserve. We've asked for it. We're guilty. The West refuses to accept its guilt or responsibility for any of this. I testified last Friday before the UN Security Council on the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline.
I was just going to ask you about that. I tracked that.
Yeah.
Great job. Great job.
Thanks. Yeah, it was interesting. Apparently, this was the 9,316th meeting. So this is not all that common. So that stretches out over 75 years now.
Amazing.
So, yeah, it's
Jeffrey Sachs was there a couple of months ago.
Yeah.
They picked some really good people, but tell us what you said to the UN Security Council, everyone. Larry was at the UN Security Council just last Friday talking about Nord Stream. Condense down what you said about Nord Stream.
Well, it's real simple that the United States did it. And I based that upon my experience with both time at the CIA, time at State Department and the Office of Counterterrorism, where I participated in the investigation of the terrorist bombing at Panam 103, my work with U.S. military special operations forces, scripting terrorist exercises, doing scenarios, understanding what would be required to carry out that kind of operation. And then my own consulting firm's work as money laundering investigators around the world. All of this points to the United States did it. Now, think through this logic. The reason the United States wanted to destroy the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is that Germany was getting this cheap natural gas from Russia and therefore was, quote, dependent on Russia because it got this cheap natural gas. So our solution is we're going to blow up that pipeline. We're going to cut off that supply of natural gas to Germany. That'll hurt the Russians. And I go, wait a second. Russia's still producing natural gas. So it can't send it through that pipeline, but it can send it through these ships and through these tankers and through these trucks. So it doesn't hurt Russia really at all. I mean, yeah, there was a loss of the material investment, but they can make that up. The one that hurts is Germany. And in fact, the German economy has declined and contracted since then. And with inflation going up, because now the Germans had to buy the same gas from Russia, only it went through different hands of middlemen, but they paid more for it because there were more people touching it and more transportation costs. So that was basically, my message was that the UN Security Council, they need to really genuinely investigate this, because under our international rules-based order, no one country should be allowed to go around and routinely, just on their own, blow up infrastructure like that. Well, the response of French, and of the worst, the rudest person at that council meeting is the French ambassador. What a pig that man is. Almost everybody else, I mean, good God, even the American representative, it wasn't the main UN rep, but it was some lower level guy. But when they start giving the floor to speak, the courtesy was, you would say, because there were two other UN briefers that preceded me, they'd go, I'd like to thank the briefer from the Assistant Secretary's office and from the Office of Counterterrorism. And if they didn't want to say thank you to me, they said, I take note of Mr. Johnson's briefing. Okay. Several of the people will thank me directly. That was nice. The Chinese, the Algerians, Mozambique, Sierra Leone. But when it comes to the French guy, he sets up, he doesn't say a word of thanks to anybody. He just launches in, attacking the Russians. Hell, this is hypocritical because they're blowing up power plants in Ukraine. Yeah, they're blowing up power plants because you, the French, are sending weapons that are killing civilians in Russia. So sit there and accuse the Russians of hypocrisy when you got blood on your hands? Sorry. I give Ambassador Nebenzia, the Russian ambassador, a lot more patient guy than I am, a lot more under control, because I would like to jump across the table and punch that French guy right in the nose, just because it was so outrageous. The American rep, when it came time, at least he had the grace to thank the UN briefers. Ignored me. I wasn't there. I was a non-person. Surprisingly, the British guy, he said, well, I thank the briefers. So, he did the normal courtesy, but it was interesting watching those three, because that US, French, British connection, they're the three troublemakers on the UNSC right now.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, as I'm sure you did, that the Nord Stream destruction was the largest industrial sabotage in history, and also released more methane into the atmosphere than any methane release in history. So it was not only an industrial sabotage, it was eco-terrorism. I mean, it did serious damage to the global ecosystem. And yet not a word was said by anyone, because everyone knew that it was the US that did it. And what was most shocking to me, and I think many people, was the way that the Germans rolled over and didn't contest it at all, even though it was clear, as you're pointing out, that the damage was not to Russia. The damage was to Germany and the European economy. The entire European economy has tanked since the beginning of the Ukraine war. And the
Yeah.
more they're caught up in the war, the more devastated their economies will be, led by Germany, which is sinking the fastest.
Right.
So this Nord Stream pipeline destruction was not an insignificant matter.
Yeah, when you look at that picture where the Joe Biden and Schultz, Olaf Schultz, were together at the White House, where Biden said, if Russia goes into Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 is gonna cease to exist. So, and the look on Schultz's face at that point really reminded me of some guy that's into sadomasochism, and he's the bondage subject, and you can see a collar around his neck, and Joe Biden over there is the dominatrix. That's what was going on. That's the kind of relationship. It was sort of perverse and degrading. But then, but they didn't. This is what drives me crazy about this. If you're going to run a covert action, at least for God's sake, be professional about it. You don't have to be Babe Ruth and point out to center field, that's where I'm going to hit it. Keep it quiet. Pretend you're not going to hit it. Don't say a word. But no. Not Biden and his crew. Yeah, it's going to cease to exist. And Victoria Nuland, happy days are here again. But then you get the likes of Sikorsky, the former foreign minister of Poland, and now current foreign minister again, I guess, who immediately tweets, "Oh, congratulations, United States, way to go!"
Yeah.
And then was it Liz Truss? I made the mistake once in a previous interview saying it's Theresa May. These English women, they all look alike. So
careful.
Oh, I'll tell you a story about that when I was in Honduras. Do you know all of us Americans look alike? But Liz Truss sends out a text message. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So they didn't even go through it. They didn't even try to hide it. The audacity of it. And it's just, it was an act of war.
Yeah.
Against Russia and against Germany. Frankly, Russia would have been entitled to start bombing the United States at that point, but chose not to.
Yeah, of course. Now, let me turn to just a final domain, Larry. I felt for some time, and I've said it on Humanity Rising, that I believe that Ukraine, the fiasco of Ukraine, was the death knell, or is the death knell of American primacy. I think that the combination of the debacle in Ukraine and the debacle in the Middle East is bringing to a close the American century, shall we call it.
Yeah.
And that what's emerging is a growing coalition between Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Iran, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and a number of other countries. And I think that the mandate from heaven, to use the Chinese term, is now moving from the United States toward Asia, and that the collapse of the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar, as these BRICS countries increasingly go off the dollar and use local currencies, is going to have a devastating effect on not only the U.S. internationally and its capacity to maintain the 800 plus bases around the world, but the U.S. domestically and financially, as the value and primacy of the dollar also collapses simultaneously. So would love to have you just comment on this particular way of viewing the immediate future of the U.S. in relationship to the BRICS nations, but also the geostrategic position of the world, because it feels to me that Ukraine and now Gaza was a bridge too far.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I don't disagree really with anything you said, except I think you left out one very important factor. The United States is still looking to get into a war with China. Oh. And if you watched what Blinken did this week,
Yeah.
You know, I've never had a reputation for being a great diplomat. I'm pretty straightforward in my speaking, and will, you know, I've been known to say the inappropriate thing from time to time. Blinken made me look like Jesus Christ in terms of diplomacy. I mean, watch, you know, he goes in, he insults the Chinese, he tells them, you know, stop trading with Russia, stop producing, you know, who are we to tell the Chinese what they need to do? Because the Chinese are looking at us saying, hey, basically mind your own business. But he does this, you know, just, you know, a few days after the U.S. House of Representatives and then the Senate approved money to arm Taiwan, which is a violation of what we agreed with the Chinese more than 52 years ago with the one China policy, that we said, yeah, Taiwan is part of China. We accept that. Well, we no longer accept that. So the Chinese are looking at us. These Americans, they don't keep their word. They can't be trusted. And on top of it, they keep the Chinese, if anyone's paying attention, they're hearing the United States describe China as an enemy. China is something that we're going to be at war with by 2025. That's coming out of the mouth of senior U.S. military commanders in the Pacific. So I don't think the United States is done digging its grave. I think you're correct. The United States is digging its grave. Ukraine was definitely a big shovelful. And then the shovel gets even deeper when we go into the Middle East, trying to pick a fight with Iran. And then the trifecta is now we're going to pick a fight with the Chinese. If we do that, I don't know if there will be a United States that would exist after all of that. I think it is that serious a matter. We're not thinking this through, and we've created these narratives that have no basis in reality, but they serve a political purpose at home to whip up emotion. You know, the Chinese, we got to stop them. They're out to dominate the world. You know, that they've got this and going, okay, time out. Tell me how many countries China has actually invaded, sent military forces into, killed people, killed like the 400,000 at least that we murdered in Iraq, killed 120,000 that we killed in Afghanistan. Show me the other countries where China's done something comparable. Oh, you can't. Because the last time China invaded a country was 1979, and they went into Vietnam because Vietnam was invading Cambodia. And that didn't turn out well for China back then. So stop this crap about China being this imperial military power out to take over the world. That's called projection. We're looking in the mirror, seeing ourselves, but imagining that we look Chinese.
Yeah. Well put. Well put.
Know?
Well put. Well, Larry, thank you so much. This has been very illuminating, I think, for all of us. And it causes me, as an American, deep anguish.
Yeah.
That our government and you know, the current administration is so tone deaf to the situation that it continues not only to foment conflict in Europe and the Middle East, but is now escalating it against China. It's like it's as if a certain madness has taken over the collective psyche of the governing elite.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you 100%, Jim. 100%.
Wow. Sobering time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that'll bring us to a close for today, everyone. You can join Larry for a few minutes in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you received it in your Zoom reminder for today. But this was a very global analysis of some of the fragilities of U.S. power in the world, and that I think all of us need to take what Larry Johnson has said extremely seriously. So thank you, Larry. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Jim.
you, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Bye for now.